The morning fog lifts slowly over the Johor Strait. It is March 8th, 2022, 7 o'clock. The tide is low and the water lies still between two countries, reflecting a sky that cannot decide between gray and blue. On the artificial islands that rise from this water, the sound is what strikes you first. Or rather, the absence of it. 65 residential towers stand in perfect rows, their white facades catching the early light. The streets below are 6 lanes wide, smooth as glass, lined with palm trees planted at precise intervals. A single car moves along one of these boulevards, its engine the only sound besides the waves. The gardeners arrive in their green uniforms. There are more gardeners here than residents. They tend flower beds that no one walks past, prune hedges that frame empty parking lots, sweep leaves from sidewalks that lead nowhere in particular. Their work is meticulous. Every blade of grass is the correct height. Every border is perfect. In the shopping center, the marble floors shine. They have been polished overnight. Of the 400 retail spaces, 17 are occupied. A fried chicken restaurant prepares for a lunch crowd that will not come. In one of the residential towers, on the 14th floor, a woman stands at her window drinking tea. She can see Singapore in the distance, a smudge of buildings across the water. Below her, 38 floors of apartments stand empty. Some have never been lived in. Some have furniture that was arranged by real estate agents in 2016 and has not been moved since. The brochures called this place the City of the Future. They promised vertical gardens and smart homes, an eco-friendly metropolis where 700,000 people would live and work and build their lives. They said it would be ready by 2035. That future has not arrived. And now, standing in this perfect, silent city, watching the gardeners work and the empty towers wait, you begin to suspect it never will. This story begins with ambition, with power, money, and a vision that seemed impossible to refuse. The idea began, as many improbable ideas do, with a prince and a deal. The year was 2006. China was rising. Its developers were building cities at a pace the world had never seen, and they were looking beyond their borders for their next projects. Malaysia, and specifically the southern state of Johor, seemed like the perfect opportunity. Sultan Ibrahim Ismail of Johor had land. More precisely, he had territorial waters. The sea itself, in the Johor Strait, where fishing boats had worked for generations, and where beneath the surface, the largest seagrass meadow in Malaysia swayed with the current. This meadow covered 36 square kilometers. It was home to seahorses and prawns, dugongs, and sea turtles. It had been there for thousands of years, but the Sultan saw something else. He approached Country Garden Holdings, one of China's largest property developers, with a proposal. What if you could build a city here, on the sea itself? What if you could create new land where there had been only water? Country Garden was interested, very interested. The company had been founded in 1992 by Yang Guoqiang, a man who had worked as a farmer and then on construction sites before building his empire. By 2006, Country Garden was developing luxury townships across China. They understood scale, they understood ambition, and they understood that the Chinese middle class was growing wealthy and looking for places to invest their money. The proposition was simple, at least on paper. Country Garden would pay the Sultan $55 million for the rights to this water. They would reclaim land from the sea, building artificial islands where none had existed. On these islands, they would construct a city. Not just a development, a city. They called it Forest City. The vision they presented was extraordinary. 4 artificial islands covering 30 square kilometers, 700,000 residents at full capacity, an entire metropolis built from nothing, rising from the sea like a modern Atlantis, but in reverse. The marketing materials showed vertical gardens covering every building, trees growing from balconies on the 40th floor, solar panels on every roof. They promised smart homes where everything could be controlled by your phone, where the city itself would learn your habits and adapt to them. They called it eco-friendly and the city of the future. There would be schools and hospitals, shopping centers and golf courses, office towers and luxury hotels. everything a city needed, except for one thing. It would need people to live there before any of this would make sense. But that, they said, would not be a problem, because Forest City was strategically located. You could see Singapore from its beaches, across a narrow strait, one of the wealthiest cities in the world, where property cost millions and where every apartment was crowded. In Forest City, you could buy a two-bedroom apartment with a sea view for $170,000. For Chinese buyers, this was especially attractive. In Shanghai or Beijing, that same money would buy you perhaps a small apartment in an outer district. Here, you could own a piece of a futuristic city in a tropical climate with international schools nearby for your children. It was, the developers said, a paradise waiting to be built. The partnership was formalized as a joint venture. Country Garden Pacific View would hold 60% of the shares. The other 40% went to Esplanade Danga 88, a company affiliated with the Johor state government's investment arm, which in turn was controlled substantially by the Sultan. The Sultan was not just a ceremonial figure. In Johor, his influence ran deep through politics and business. His involvement sent a signal. This project had the blessing of power. It would proceed. The plan was for a 20-year development. Phase by phase, island by island, a city would emerge. The first island would cover 979 acres. The second, even larger, 1,896 acres. Then a third and a fourth. The total investment, they said, would reach $100 billion. 100 billion. The number is difficult to comprehend. It would make Forest City one of the most expensive real estate projects ever attempted anywhere on Earth. For comparison, the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, cost $1.5 billion to build. Forest City would cost more than 60 Burj Khalifas. But in China in 2006, this kind of thinking did not seem absurd. The Chinese economy was growing at 9% a year. The government had just announced a $568 billion stimulus package, much of it flowing into real estate. Across China, entire cities were being built in months. The phrase Chinese speed meant something. It meant that what seemed impossible was merely difficult, and what seemed difficult was inevitable. Country Garden believed. The Sultan believed. And when the project was officially launched, with the approval of Prime Minister Najib Razak, it seemed Malaysia believed too. Forest City would be the jewel of the Iskandar Special Economic Zone, a massive development initiative in Johor designed to rival Singapore. It would create jobs, attract investment, put Malaysia on the map as a destination for international capital. At the groundbreaking ceremony, speeches were made about cooperation between nations, about the future, about prosperity. Architects unveiled renderings. Models of the islands were displayed, perfect miniature versions of the dream. No one spoke much about the seagrass meadow. No one mentioned the fishermen from Kampung Tanjung Kupang, the village that had been there for generations. No one asked what happens when you build 4 islands in a narrow strait, what that does to the currents, to the marine life, to the people who had relied on these waters for their livelihood. Those questions would come later. For now, there was only the dream. A dream of towers and gardens, of luxury and technology, of a city that would house 750,000 people in a paradise built on the sea. The future, they said, had begun. Once the dream was approved, reality moved quickly, faster than the land itself could handle. On January 1, 2014, fishermen near Kampung Pak watched as a fleet of barges appeared in waters where they had fished all their lives. There had been no announcement, no consultation, just the sudden arrival of vessels, dredgers, and dump trucks on floating platforms. Within days, they were watching sand being poured into the sea. Country Garden had begun the reclamation without completing a detailed environmental impact assessment. Malaysian law required such an assessment for any coastal reclamation project over 50 hectares. Forest City would eventually cover 3,000 hectares. The company had found a loophole. They split the project into smaller phases. The first reclamation was listed as 49.3 hectares, just under the threshold. The Johor Department of Environment approved it in days. Construction began immediately. What followed was a demonstration of Chinese industrial capability at its most impressive and most ruthless. The land reclamation happened at what observers called frantic pace. Sand was dredged from the seabed and from hills in the surrounding area. Some sources suggest sand was being extracted without proper permits, disfiguring local landscapes. The sand was mixed with rock and concrete, then poured into the sea between two silt curtains designed to prevent sediment from spreading through the strait. The silt curtains failed, or were not properly installed, or were simply overwhelmed by the scale of the operation. Fishermen from Kampung Tanjung Kupang began reporting problems immediately. Their catches declined. The water turned murky. When they complained to local authorities, nothing happened. The project had protection at the highest levels. By May 2014, Singapore had noticed. From across the strait, the island city-state watched as an artificial island began to take shape in waters they shared. They sent a diplomatic note to Malaysia requesting clarification. This was required under a 2005 agreement between the two countries, mediated by the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which stated that either country must inform the other before undertaking major reclamation work. Malaysia had not informed Singapore. Environmental groups began to mobilize. Scientists pointed out that Forest City was being built in an environmentally sensitive area rank 1 zone, where Malaysian regulations prohibited any development except for low-impact nature tourism, research, and education. Two areas of international ecological significance were directly threatened. The Tanjung Kupang seagrass meadow, the one the Sultan had sold, was being cut in half by the reclamation, and the Pulai River Mangrove Forest Reserve, a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention, was downstream from the construction site, vulnerable to changes in water flow and sediment. The Malaysian Federal Department of Environment, under pressure from Singapore and facing growing public outcry, finally acted. On June 6, 2014, they sent a formal request to Country Garden to complete a proper environmental impact assessment. 11 days later, they issued a stop work order. For a moment, it seemed the dream might end before it had truly begun, but only for a moment. Country Garden responded with a masterclass in corporate crisis management. They announced they were downsizing the project by 1/3. Instead of one massive island, they would build 4 smaller islands, with buffer zones between them. They promised to install double-layered silt curtains. They committed to environmental monitoring, to mangrove restoration, to creating new habitats for prawns and fish. They hired Sasaki, a prestigious American planning firm, to create a new master plan that would emphasize environmental sensitivity and international best practices. Most importantly, they continued to have the support of the Sultan and the Johor state government. Behind the scenes, the project was too big to stop. Too much money had been committed. Too many powerful people had staked their reputations on it. By late 2014, with a revised environmental impact assessment submitted and approved, construction resumed. What happened next was remarkable, even by the standards of modern megaprojects. Country Garden brought in thousands of workers. The majority were not Malaysian. They were low-wage laborers from South Asia, working 12-hour shifts, living in temporary housing. There were also white-collar Chinese workers, brought in to manage the project, to oversee quality control, to ensure things moved at Chinese speed. Some local Malaysians were hired, but they were a minority. This would become a source of resentment later. The reclamation of the first island happened in under 90 days. 90 days to create 979 acres of land where there had been only water. For comparison, when Singapore does land reclamation, they let the new land settle for years before building on it. This gives the soil time to stabilize, to compact, to become something you can actually build on safely. Country Garden did not wait. They began construction on the first buildings while the land was still settling beneath them. By 2016, the first residential towers were complete. The Carnelian Tower, the tallest building in Forest City, stood 45 stories high, rising 196 meters above the sea. Its facade was white, clean, modern. From certain angles, in certain light, it looked exactly like the renderings from the brochures. The construction continued across the island. By 2019, 65 residential towers had been completed, more than 200 luxury villas, a 4-story shopping center with 400 retail spaces, 2 5-star hotels, 2 golf courses designed to international standards. Forest City International School, a private institution, opened its doors in 2018. The infrastructure was extraordinary. The roads were perfect. The landscaping was immaculate. Every tree had been imported and planted according to plan. The beaches were white sand, brought in and shaped by hand. There was even an eco-museum, a facility designed to educate visitors about marine conservation, filled with displays about the very ecosystem the project had destroyed. The numbers were staggering. 26,000 residential units completed, miles of roads, parks and gardens covering hundreds of acres, a city built entirely from nothing in less than 5 years. By 2019, Country Garden reported that 20,000 of those residential units had been sold. What they did not say was how many were occupied. Problems began to appear almost immediately. In the show gallery, the building where sales were conducted, cracks appeared in the walls, then in hotel buildings, then in the roads themselves. A building consultant was brought in. He observed that the reclaimed land was sinking. The foundation was subsiding. The soil had not been given time to stabilize before construction began. The buildings were too heavy for ground that was still settling. The consultant warned that the subsidence would continue. No one knows how much worse it might get. But by then, the first towers were occupied. Somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people had moved in, most of them Chinese nationals who had purchased apartments during the initial sales rush of 2015 and 2016. They moved into a city that was perhaps 95% empty. There was a moment, brief and bright, when it seemed to work. December 2015. The sales gallery in Forest City opens its doors. Buses arrive from Singapore, dozens of them, filled with potential buyers. Inside the gallery, there are more than 1,000 sales agents. They are not enough to handle the crowd. People are buying apartments that do not yet exist. Pre-sales, they are called. You pay a deposit for a unit that is still just a number on a blueprint, in a building that has not been built, in a city that is still mostly underwater. But the brochures are beautiful, the models are convincing, and the price is right. For wealthy Chinese buyers, Forest City represents something they cannot easily get at home. It is foreign property, which means it is outside the reach of Chinese government policy. It is an asset that might appreciate. It is in Southeast Asia, close to Singapore, in a tropical climate. It is, the sales agents say, an investment in the future. The Chinese middle class has money to spend. Years of economic growth have created hundreds of millions of people with savings, with wealth, with the ability to buy property abroad. Malaysia is easier to reach than Australia or Canada. The paperwork is simpler. The prices are lower. In that first year, sales exceed expectations. Country Garden sells unit after unit, tower after tower. The money flows in. This is the peak. On April 22, 2016, Prime Minister Najib Razak officially opens Forest City. The Sultan of Johor is there. Country Garden's executives are there. There are speeches about friendship between Malaysia and China, about prosperity, about the future. The first residents have moved in by now. There are perhaps a few hundred of them. They live in towers that are otherwise empty, surrounded by construction equipment, in a city that is still being built around them. For these first residents, Forest City is not yet what it will become. It is still full of promise. The apartments are new and spacious. The sea views are real. There is a sense of being at the beginning of something. One resident, interviewed years later, remembers those early days with something like nostalgia. It felt special, he said, like we were pioneers. We were the first people in a new city. The schools begin to operate. Forest City International School enrolls its first students. Children attend classes in state-of-the-art facilities, though there are not enough children to fill the classrooms. The hotels open. They are 5-star establishments with all the amenities one would expect. Marble lobbies, infinity pools, restaurants with ocean views. Wedding photographers come to shoot couples on the white sand beaches. against the backdrop of modern towers. The golf courses are pristine. On weekends, a few players from Singapore cross the border to play 18 holes in relative solitude. It is a strange experience. The courses are perfect, maintained as though thousands of people play here every week. But there is hardly anyone. The shopping center is the most unsettling. 4 floors, 400 retail spaces, marble floors that shine. But only 17 spaces are occupied. A fried chicken restaurant, a small cafe, a hot pot restaurant with gleaming pots and no customers. 5 duty-free shops do better business, selling beer and whiskey to day trippers from Singapore. The other 383 spaces are empty. Some were fitted out by hopeful retailers who never opened. Some are just empty shells, waiting for tenants who never materialized. Walking through the shopping center is like walking through a beautiful corpse. Everything is perfect. Everything is clean. Nothing lives here. But for a moment, in 2016, it seemed possible that this was just growing pains. Forest City was still being built. More residents would come. The empty spaces would fill. This was a city in progress, not a city in decline. Country Garden reported strong sales. 80% of the available units had been sold, they said. The numbers looked good. What they did not reveal was that most buyers had no intention of living there. For the majority of Chinese purchasers, Forest City was an investment vehicle, a way to move money out of China, a property that might appreciate, that could be rented out or resold later. They bought the apartments, but they did not collect their keys. Rumors circulated that thousands of units remained unclaimed, owned by people who had never visited Forest City, who had no plans to visit, who perhaps could not visit even if they wanted to. Still, in 2016, the peak year, Forest City could point to its sales figures and say, "This is working." The Sultan of Johor proposed a high-speed rail link from Kuala Lumpur to Singapore, with a stop at Forest City. It would bring residents, he said. It would bring workers. It would make the city viable. Country Garden announced Phase 2. They would begin reclamation on the second island, almost twice as large as the first. There would be more towers, more villas, more hotels. The dream would expand. In photographs from this time, Forest City looks impressive. The towers stand proud against blue sky. The beaches are white. The gardens are green. If you frame it correctly, if you avoid showing the empty streets and vacant windows, it looks like success. This is the image they exported to the world. This is what the marketing materials showed, a thriving city of the future. But in truth, even at the peak, Forest City was already a ghost town. It just had not admitted it yet. The question is, when did they know? At what point did the executives at Country Garden realize that their dream of 700,000 residents was not going to happen? When did the Sultan understand that his $55 million investment was tied to a city that would never be filled? The answer is unclear. Perhaps they knew all along. Perhaps they believed the momentum would carry them through. Perhaps they thought that if they kept building, kept marketing, kept insisting that Forest City was the future, eventually it would become true through sheer force of will. Or perhaps they simply did not want to look too closely at what they had created. Because if you stood in Forest City in 2016 at its peak and you really looked, you could see it. The emptiness, the silence, the sense of a city without a soul. But it is hard to see what you do not want to see. And in 2016, there were still reasons for hope. Those reasons would not last long. The unraveling did not come all at once. It came in waves, each one eroding a little more of the foundation, until what remained could no longer stand. The first wave came from Beijing. In 2017, the Chinese government imposed new restrictions on capital outflow. Chinese citizens could only transfer $50,000 per year outside the country. Previously, the limit had been much higher, and enforcement had been lax. Now, it was strictly monitored. For Forest City, this was catastrophic. The entire business model depended on Chinese buyers moving hundreds of thousands of dollars out of China to purchase property in Malaysia. With the new restrictions, that became effectively impossible for most people. You could not buy a $170,000 apartment if you could only send $50,000 a year abroad. Sales collapsed. Country Garden tried to adapt. They shifted their marketing toward Malaysians, toward Singaporeans, toward other international buyers. But Forest City was too expensive for most Malaysians. The average household in Malaysia earned $16,400 a year. Even the smallest units cost more than 10 years' salary. And Singaporeans were not interested. Why would they be? Singapore had its own property market. It was expensive, but it was stable, established, with real communities and real jobs. Forest City offered none of that. The second wave came in 2018. Malaysia held elections. Najib Razak, the prime minister who had championed Forest City, who had attended its opening ceremony, was defeated. He would later be convicted of corruption charges related to other projects. His successor was Mahathir Mohamad, 92 years old, a legendary figure in Malaysian politics, known for his nationalism and his suspicion of foreign influence. Mahathir looked at Forest City and saw a problem. He saw a project built for foreigners, not for Malaysians. He saw Chinese investment that seemed designed to benefit Chinese buyers rather than local people. He gave speeches criticizing the project as being built for foreigners. In August 2018, he announced that foreigners would be banned from buying property in Forest City. This announcement sent shockwaves through the project. It was later walked back, technically restructured as changes to the Malaysia My Second Home visa program, rather than an outright ban. But the damage was done. The message was clear. This project was not welcome, not in its current form. For Chinese buyers who had already purchased units, the value of their investments plummeted overnight. Some tried to sell. The market was flooded with resale units at steep discounts. People who had paid $170,000 were trying to sell for $100,000, then $80,000. There were no buyers. Some Chinese nationals who had moved to Forest City decided to leave. They sold at a loss or simply walked away, leaving their apartments empty. The population, which had never been large, began to shrink. Country Garden laid off staff. They cut back on new construction. Phase 2, the second island, which had been announced with such confidence, was delayed. But the third wave was yet to come. COVID-19 arrived in Malaysia in early 2020. By March, the country was in lockdown. Movement was restricted. Borders closed. International travel became impossible. For Forest City, which depended on attracting buyers and residents from other countries, this was fatal. The few residents who remained were trapped. Many of them worked in Singapore. The border between Malaysia and Singapore became one of the most difficult crossings in the world during the pandemic. Even when it opened, crossing required permits, testing, quarantine. It became easier for many residents to simply leave Forest City altogether. Tourism stopped. No more wedding photographers. No more day trippers from Singapore coming to play golf or visit the duty-free shops. The hotels, which had never been full, became completely empty. Sales, which had already declined to nearly nothing, stopped entirely. In 18 months following March 2020, Country Garden sold fewer than 10 properties in Forest City. The company laid off 2/3 of its staff. The ones who remained were maintenance workers and security guards. Their job was not to build a city anymore. It was simply to keep it from falling apart. By 2022, Forest City had perhaps 2,000 residents. Some estimates put it even lower. In a city designed for 700,000 people, built at a cost of tens of billions of dollars, with 26,000 completed residential units, only a tiny fraction was occupied. The fourth wave hit in 2023. Country Garden, the developer, had been expanding rapidly across China and beyond. They had taken on enormous debt to fund their projects. By 2023, the Chinese real estate market was in crisis. Developers across the country were defaulting on bonds, failing to complete projects, going bankrupt. In August 2023, Country Garden announced it would defer payment on its debts. The company owed nearly $200 billion. In October, it was officially deemed in default on approximately $11 billion in offshore bonds. Country Garden was collapsing, and Forest City, their flagship international project, their symbol of Chinese ambition abroad, was part of that collapse. What had gone wrong? The question has many answers. The Chinese capital controls, Mahathir's political opposition, the pandemic, Country Garden's financial mismanagement, the oversupply of property in the region, the lack of jobs within Forest City itself, the environmental damage that made the project controversial, the rushed construction that led to structural problems, the fundamental question of who would want to live in a city with no community, no history, no reason to exist beyond real estate speculation. All of these are true, and yet they do not quite capture it. Because the real problem was simpler and more profound. Forest City was built on an assumption that proved false. The assumption was that if you build a city, people will come. That supply creates its own demand. That luxury and modernity and perfect infrastructure are enough. They are not enough. A city needs a reason to exist beyond itself. It needs jobs. It needs culture. It needs a sense of place, of community, of belonging. You cannot manufacture these things. You cannot import them. They have to grow organically, slowly, through the accumulation of human life and human interaction. Forest City had none of this. It was a real estate project pretending to be a city. And when the real estate market collapsed, there was nothing underneath. By 2024, Forest City had become infamous. Articles appeared in international media calling it the world's most expensive ghost town, a massive boondoggle, one of the most useless megaprojects ever built. Journalists visited and filmed the empty streets, the vacant shopping center, the towers with no lights in their windows. These videos went viral. Millions of people watched footage of this strange, silent place, this city that was somehow both finished and abandoned. The Malaysian government, embarrassed by the international attention, began to look for solutions. In July 2024, Parliament passed legislation designating Forest City as a duty-free island and a special financial zone. They offered tax incentives, flat income tax rates of 15% for residents, fast-track visas for people working in Singapore. They were trying to make Forest City attractive again, to find some way to justify its existence. Whether it will work remains to be seen. But the fall is complete. Forest City stands now not as a city of the future, but as a monument to hubris, to miscalculation, to the gap between vision and reality. And yet, it persists. The towers do not fall. The gardens are still maintained. The lights still work. It is not abandoned in the traditional sense. It is not Pripyat or Bodhi, overtaken by nature, reclaimed by time. It is something stranger. A ghost town that is perfectly maintained. A failure that refuses to admit it has failed. On a Tuesday afternoon in November 2024, a woman stands on a balcony on the 32nd floor of a residential tower in Forest City. She is one of perhaps 9,000 residents, though estimates vary. Some say 20,000. Some say as few as 2,000. No one knows exactly. She looks out over the city. From this height, it looks impressive. The geometry of it, the clean lines of the towers, the curves of the roads, the green spaces between buildings. On the horizon, Singapore shimmers in the heat. Closer, the beach is empty except for a few scattered figures. The woman is Malaysian Indian. She lives here with her husband. She declines to give her name to visitors. When asked what it is like to live in Forest City, she says only that the next tower over is busier. This is not a high bar. Below her, at street level, the gardeners are working. They come every day. They maintain this place as though it were a thriving city. The flower beds are perfect. The lawns are manicured. The palm trees are healthy and well watered. This is their job, to keep Forest City looking like a city even though it is not one. In the shopping center, a few shops remain open. A cafe serves coffee to the occasional customer. The fried chicken restaurant does steady business with the maintenance workers. 5 duty-free shops sell alcohol and cigarettes. The hot pot restaurant is usually empty, its pots gleaming, waiting. The rest of the retail space is vacant. 383 empty shops. Some have been fitted out completely, ready for business that never came. Some are just empty concrete boxes. A children's train sits in the center of the mall. It runs on a loop. There are no children. The driver does his rounds anyway, circling endlessly through the empty halls. This is what Forest City has become. A perfectly maintained failure. A city that exists more as an idea than as a reality. The residential towers tell the story most clearly. 26,000 units. Perhaps 3,000 are occupied. The rest are empty. Some have never been entered since they were completed. Some were purchased by investors who never collected their keys. Some were briefly occupied and then abandoned when residents moved away. In one tower, entire floors are completely empty. Doors open to the touch, revealing marble interiors, modern kitchens, floor-to-ceiling windows with ocean views. Dead leaves have blown into some units. Others have notices from 2022 still taped to the door, announcing residents' meetings that no one attended. At night, you can see which buildings have residents by counting the lit windows. There are not many. Forest City International School continues to operate. There are students there. Children of the few families who have chosen to make this place their home, or who are trying to. The school is good. The facilities are excellent. But the playground is rarely full. The 2 hotels remain open, though occupancy is low. Occasionally, wedding photographers bring couples here for shoots. The empty beaches, the modern architecture, make good backdrops. Forest City has found a new use as a filming location. Netflix shot parts of a reality show here in 2023, using the ghost city as a surreal setting for their competition. There is something almost science fiction about it. A city built for hundreds of thousands, inhabited by thousands. It looks like the aftermath of some event, some catastrophe that removed all the people but left everything else intact. But there was no catastrophe. Just bad planning and bad luck and bad timing. Just the ordinary failure of extraordinary ambition. The environmental legacy is perhaps the most permanent. The seagrass meadow is gone. Where there had been 36 square kilometers of underwater ecosystem, there is now an artificial island. The fishermen from Kampung Tanjung Kupang still fish, but they go farther out now, into deeper water, because the shallow waters where they used to work are gone. The Pulai River mangrove forest has been affected by changes in water flow and sedimentation patterns. Scientists who study the area speak carefully, but their measurements are clear. Biodiversity has declined. Species that depended on these waters have moved or died out. Country Garden set up a compensation fund for affected fishermen. The fund is managed by local officials. There are allegations of corruption, of money not reaching the people it was supposed to help. No one is surprised. The land itself continues to subside. The buildings continue to sink slowly into ground that was never stable. How much worse this will get, no one knows. Engineers monitor the situation. For now, the buildings are safe. For how long, that is uncertain. Country Garden itself is fighting for survival. The company that once employed hundreds of thousands of people, that built cities across China and beyond, is drowning in debt. Forest City is a symbol of its ambition and its failure. The Malaysian government continues to try to revive Forest City. The Special Financial Zone designation is their latest attempt. They are trying to attract financial services companies, technology firms, any business that might be drawn by the tax incentives and the empty office space. Some investors have expressed interest. Family offices, primarily. Wealthy individuals looking for favorable tax treatment for their assets. Whether they will actually come, whether they will bring enough people to make a difference, remains to be seen. There is also talk of the high-speed rail again. The Sultan of Johor continues to push for it. A train from Kuala Lumpur to Singapore with a stop at Forest City. It would bring commuters, he says. It would make the city viable. Perhaps. But a train requires passengers, and it is not clear where those passengers would come from. For now, Forest City exists in a strange limbo. It is not quite dead, but it is not alive either. It is maintained but not inhabited. It is complete but not functional. It is a city without citizens, a metropolis without a polis. Visitors come occasionally. Photographers, journalists, YouTubers looking for content. They film the empty streets, the vacant apartments, the shopping center with no shoppers. They post videos with titles like "Inside the $100 Billion Ghost Town" or "The City That Failed." These videos get millions of views. People are fascinated by Forest City. It represents something they recognize: the hubris of megaprojects, the dangers of speculation, the way that money and power can build things that have no real purpose beyond their own existence. But there are also the residents, the few thousand people who actually live there. They are not symbols, they are not metaphors. They are people trying to live their lives in a place that was never designed for actual living. Some of them chose Forest City because it was affordable, because they could get a large apartment with an ocean view for less than they would pay elsewhere, because the schools were good, because they valued the peace and quiet. Some of them are making the best of it. They have formed small communities. They organize social events. They try to create the sense of neighborhood that the developers never managed to manufacture. But they also acknowledge the strangeness of it, the emptiness, the feeling of living in a place that was built for a future that never arrived. It is peaceful, one resident says, sometimes too peaceful. Another, you get used to the quiet, but it would be nice if there were more people. It would be nice if it felt like a real city. These are the people who inhabit the legacy. They live in the gap between the dream and the reality. They are the actual residents of the city of the future, and they wait as the gardeners work and the buildings stand and the sea laps at the artificial shores to see what comes next. Whether Forest City will find a purpose, whether it will fill up slowly, quietly, over decades, whether it will remain as it is, a perfectly maintained ghost town, or whether it will eventually be abandoned completely, left to the water and the wind. For now, it simply exists. $100 billion of steel and concrete and marble and glass, standing mostly empty under the tropical sun, a monument to something that was supposed to be great and became instead a question mark. There is a photograph taken from a satellite that shows Forest City at night. From this distance, from orbit, you can see the shape of it. The 4 islands laid out in the water, the lights of Singapore blazing to the south, and Forest City itself, the outlines of its towers visible but dim, most of its windows dark. It looks small from up there, fragile, a human thing in a vast landscape of water and darkness. Cities are among the most complex things human beings create. They take centuries to develop, usually. They grow organically, around rivers or harbors, around trade routes or natural resources. They accumulate history and culture and purpose. They become more than the sum of their buildings. They become places that people identify with, that people belong to. Forest City was an attempt to skip all of that, to build the end result without going through the process, to create a city, fully formed, in less than a decade. It is not the first time this has been tried. Company towns, planned cities, megaprojects have been built throughout history. Some of them have worked, some of them have failed. Most of them have become something different than what their planners intended. Brasilia was built as Brazil's new capital in the late 1950s. Oscar Niemeyer's modernist masterpiece, designed from scratch in the center of the country. It was supposed to be the city of the future, an architectural wonder that would transform Brazil. It became a government city. Bureaucrats live there because they have to. Most of them leave on weekends. It has never become the cultural or economic heart of Brazil. That remains São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, cities that were not planned, that grew messily and vitally over centuries. Shenzhen was a fishing village in 1979. Deng Xiaoping declared it a special economic zone, and over the following decades it was built into a megacity of over 12 million people. This is often cited as the success story, proof that instant cities can work. But Shenzhen had something Forest City does not. It had a purpose. It was where Chinese manufacturing met global markets. It had jobs, millions of them. People came to Shenzhen because they could work there, because they could build their lives there. The city grew around an economic function. Forest City has no economic function. It was built to be lived in, but with no reason to live there beyond the act of living itself. Perhaps that was always the fatal flaw. Or perhaps the problem is deeper. Perhaps we have reached a point in human history where we have the technical capacity to build things we do not fully understand. We can construct towers and reclaim land from the sea. We can build entire cities in years instead of centuries. But we have not yet figured out how to make those cities meaningful, how to make them necessary. Forest City raises uncomfortable questions about development, about growth, about the relationship between capital and community, about whether the things we can build are the things we should build. It also raises questions about what we value. Forest City was marketed as eco-friendly, but it destroyed an ecosystem. It was marketed as a future city, but it has no future. It was marketed as a paradise, but it is a place that most people choose not to live. What does it mean when we build paradises and then find them empty? Standing in Forest City, looking at its empty perfection, you might feel many things: sadness at the waste, wonder at the scale, unease at the silence, anger at the environmental destruction, sympathy for the few residents trying to make a life here. But perhaps the strongest feeling is something harder to name, a sense of something fundamental being wrong, not just with this project, but with the entire logic that produced it. Forest City was built because it seemed profitable, because the numbers on paper looked good, because there was money to be made in Chinese real estate speculation and Malaysian government deals and tax-free special economic zones. It was not built because anyone needed it. Not the fishermen who lost their waters, not the Malaysians who could not afford it, not the Chinese buyers who purchased units they never intended to occupy, not the environment it destroyed. It was built for itself, for the idea of building, for the dream of future cities and modern living and technological paradise. And now it stands, mostly empty, $100 billion question mark in the middle of the Johor Strait. The question it asks is not what went wrong. That answer is clear enough. The question is deeper. The question is, what are we doing? What are we doing when we build cities no one lives in? When we destroy ecosystems for real estate developments? When we pursue growth for its own sake, without asking what that growth is for? Forest City does not answer these questions. It only asks them quietly, as the sea wind moves through its empty streets and the lights in Singapore shine across the water and the few residents go about their lives in their perfect silent towers. The gardeners will be back tomorrow morning. They will tend the flower beds that no one walks past, prune the hedges that frame the empty parking lots, sweep the leaves from the perfect sidewalks. They will do their job. They will maintain the city, and Forest City will continue to exist, neither living nor dead, a monument to human ambition and human folly, waiting for a future that may never come.